The cold, unforgiving metal of a suppressed pistol was leveled less than 2 inches from my temple, yet the terrifying man whose shoulder I had somehow turned into a pillow simply raised a single, leather-gloved finger to halt my execution. Welcome back to the channel. If you are addicted to thrilling boy love stories full of dark suspense, intense mafia romance, and unpredictable twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and comment down below what you think will happen next. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories to life every single week. Now take a deep breath, and let's dive into the story. Part 1. The Awakening of the Enigma. The rhythmic, hypnotic clacking of the Midnight Express train had always been Kalen's sanctuary. It was the only place in the city where the crushing weight of reality seemed to pause. For Kalen Vance, a 23-year-old archivist drowning under the impossible debt his estranged father had left behind, sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. Working 3 grueling jobs left him existing in a permanent state of hollow exhaustion. His mind, usually a disciplined fortress of logic and stoic control, had simply reached its absolute limit. He had only meant to close his eyes for a single minute. Just 60 seconds of darkness while he sat in what he thought was an empty, dimly lit VIP cabin at the very back of the train. When consciousness finally clawed its way back to him, the first thing Kalen registered was the scent. It was not the stale, metallic odor of the public transit system. It was an intoxicating, suffocating blend of dark cedar, expensive bergamot, and an undertone of something sharp and dangerous, like ozone just before a lightning strike. The second thing he registered was the warmth. His cheek was pressed against something incredibly firm, draped in fabric so soft and expensive it felt like a caress against his tired skin. He was leaning on someone. A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed in the quiet cabin, followed by the terrifying, distinct click of multiple firearm safeties being disengaged. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The dim, warm light of the luxury cabin illuminated a scene straight out of a nightmare. For men in immaculate, tailored black suits stood in a semicircle around the leather booth. Every single one of them had a weapon drawn, and every single barrel was pointed directly at Kalen's head. Their expressions were a mix of absolute horror and murderous intent. Kalen didn't scream. He didn't thrash. Years of training his mind to separate emotion from reality kicked in. Panic is a choice, he reminded himself, forcing his heart rate to slow, his breathing to remain shallow and even. Assess. Survive. He slowly tilted his head up, tracking the line of the broad, impeccably tailored shoulder he was currently using as a mattress, past a crisp black collar, up to a jawline carved from granite. The man sitting beside him had not moved a millimeter. He was staring straight ahead at the rain lashing against the train window, his posture radiating a terrifying, absolute stillness. He looked to be in his early 30s, with raven-black hair swept back meticulously. But it was his eyes that made the breath catch in Kalen's throat. When the man finally turned his head to look down at him, Kalen met a gaze of fractured, piercing silver. They were the eyes of an apex predator, calculating, completely devoid of warmth, and holding a depth of power that made the air in the cabin feel impossibly thin. This wasn't just an alpha. This was Julian Blackwood, the Enigma. The Blackwood Syndicate controlled everything in the city that the light didn't touch. Julian Blackwood was a myth whispered about in back alleys and corporate boardrooms alike. An enigma, a genetic rarity so dominant that even the most powerful alphas bowed their heads in his presence. He was known for being utterly ruthless, untouchable, and notoriously averse to physical contact. Rumor had it that he hadn't let anyone within arm's reach in over a decade without them ending up in the harbor. And Kalen had just drooled on his cashmere lapel. "Boss," one of the guards whispered, his voice trembling despite the gun in his hand. "Give the word. I'll dispose of him. We don't know how he slipped past the perimeter." Kalen swallowed hard, slowly pulling himself upright. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He simply sat back, creating an inch of space between himself and the most dangerous man in the country. He kept his eyes locked on Julian's silver gaze, refusing to show the primal terror screaming in his veins. "I apologize," Kalen said, his voice surprisingly steady, a quiet anchor in the tense room. "I am a civilian. I work the night shift at the National Library. I entered this car believing it was out of service. Exhaustion overtook me. It was an inexcusable breach of your space, but it was not an assassination attempt." Julian Blackwood did not blink. He stared at Kalen, his silver eyes mapping every micro-expression on Kalen's face. The Enigma's pheromones, usually tightly leashed, began to leak into the air, a heavy, crushing pressure designed to force submission. The guards surrounding them physically recoiled, their heads bowing instinctively under the oppressive weight of their boss's aura. Kalen felt the invisible weight pressing down on his chest, urging him to drop to his knees, to expose his throat, to beg. But Kalen closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fortifying his mind. My mind is my own. My will is my own. He met Julian's gaze again, his spine straight, his chin level. He did not yield. A flicker of something, surprise? Intrigue? Passed through Julian's eyes, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Julian raised his right hand. A single, leather-gloved index finger lifted. Instantly, the four guards holstered their weapons and stepped back, blending into the shadows of the cabin like obedient ghosts. The oppressive, crushing pheromones receded, leaving the air thick but breathable. You did not flinch. Julian's voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Kalen's spine. It sounded like velvet wrapped around a blade. Most men, when waking up to four guns in their face, display a physiological response of extreme panic. You assessed the situation and formulated a defense. You are either incredibly well-trained or deeply broken. I simply prefer not to suffer a situation twice, Kalen replied quietly, dusting off his worn, faded coat. Once in my imagination, and once in reality. Panic serves no logical purpose here. Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The movement was slow, deliberate, predatory. He was close enough now that Kalen could see the faint, silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow. What is your name? Kalen Vance. Kalen Vance. Julian tasted the syllables, his eyes dropping to the faint, damp spot on his own shoulder. Do you know who I am, Kalen Vance? Yes, Mr. Blackwood. I am aware. And yet, your heart rate is steady. You are looking me directly in the eye. You used me as a pillow for exactly 42 minutes, and you are not begging for your life. Julian tilted his head, his gaze intensely searching Kalen's face. My guards wanted to execute you the moment you walked into this reserved car. I told them to wait. Kalen's breath hitched slightly. Why? Because, Julian murmured, his voice dropping to a hypnotic register. I suffer from chronic, intractable insomnia. I have not slept for more than 2 hours a night in 3 years. My mind does not quiet down. Ever. He paused, his silver eyes flashing with an unreadable emotion. But when you sat down, when you slumped against me, for the first time in 1,000 days, the noise in my head stopped. You radiate a psychological silence that I have never encountered. Before Kalen could process the gravity of that confession, the heavy sliding door of the VIP cabin suddenly clicked and hissed open. The atmosphere in the room shattered. Julian's posture instantly went rigid, his aura snapping back into the icy, impenetrable fortress of the Enigma. Standing in the doorway was a man wrapped in an ostentatious fur-lined coat, accompanied by his own heavily armed detail. It was Viktor Volkov, the head of the rival Northern Syndicate, a man known for his brutal ambition and his relentless attempts to force a merger with the Blackwood Empire through an arranged marriage with his Omega daughter. Julian, Victor boomed, his voice aggressively loud, his eyes sweeping the cabin before landing on Kalen. A cruel, triumphant smirk spread across his face. I heard a rumor you were on the Midnight Express. I thought I would take the opportunity to discuss the marriage proposal. My daughter is growing impatient. And as the council has reminded you, an enigma without a bonded mate is considered unstable, a liability to the balance of our world. Victor's eyes lingered on Kalen's cheap coat, his messy hair, and his proximity to the untouchable Julian Blackwood. But what is this? The untouchable enigma, sharing a private car with a stray? Have you resorted to picking up street trash, Julian? Or is this just a momentary distraction before you finally accept your duties? Kalen felt the immediate danger. He knew the politics of the underworld only from the news, but the tension in the room was explosive. If Julian appeared weak, if he appeared to be entertaining trash, it could be used against him. Kalen began to slide across the leather seat, intending to stand up, apologize, and remove himself from the crossfire. I was just leaving. A hand clamped around Kalen's wrist. The grip was forged of iron and heat. Kalen gasped, his head snapping to the right. Julian hadn't just stopped him from leaving. He pulled Kalen back, dragging him smoothly and forcefully across the seat until Kalen's side was pressed flush against Julian's chest. The Enigma's arm slid around Kalen's waist, locking him in place with possessive, inescapable strength. The entire cabin froze. Viktor Volkov's smug smile vanished, replaced by utter shock. Even Julian's own guards shifted uneasily in the shadows. Julian Blackwood did not touch people. He certainly did not pull random civilians into his lap in front of rival bosses. You misunderstand the situation, Victor, Julian said. His voice was no longer the quiet, curious tone he had used with Kalen. It was a weapon of mass destruction. Cold, arrogant, and dripping with lethal authority. Julian's hand moved from Kalen's waist, his long fingers trailing up to cup Kalen's jaw. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to Kalen's core. Julian's thumb brushed softly against Kalen's lower lip, a gesture of such profound, shocking intimacy that Kalen forgot how to breathe. "This is not a distraction," Julian declared, his silver eyes locking onto Victor with a predatory glare. "And you will never speak of him with that tone again if you wish to keep your tongue. The council worries about my lack of a bonded mate. Tell them their concerns are outdated." Victor sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "You cannot be serious." "Him. A nobody. You are rejecting my daughter for this?" "I am rejecting your daughter because she is a Volkov," Julian said smoothly, his thumb still tracing the line of Kalen's jaw. He leaned in, his face inches from Kalen's, speaking loud enough for the cabin to hear, but keeping his gaze locked entirely on Kalen. "And because I have already found the one who quiets my mind. Kalen is my exclusive companion. My intended." The lie was so smooth, so utterly convincing, that for a wild, terrifying second, Kalen almost believed it himself. The heat radiating from Julian's body was overwhelming. The scent of cedar and ozone was making Kalen lightheaded. He wanted to pull away, to scream that it was a misunderstanding, but the heavy, deliberate pressure of Julian's fingers against his neck was a silent, undeniable warning. Play along, or we both deal with the consequences. Kalen's mind raced. He had no power here, but he had control over himself. If this was a play, he would act his part flawlessly. He relaxed his rigid muscles, leaning into Julian's touch. He looked up at the Enigma, softening his eyes, letting out a small, quiet breath that brushed against Julian's lips. It was a masterclass in feigned devotion. Julian's eyes darkened slightly at the performance. The Enigma's grip on Kalen's waist tightened, pulling him even closer. "I see," Victor snarled, taking a step back as if burned by the sheer intensity of the Enigma's possessive aura. "We will see what the High Council has to say about the mighty Blackwood Syndicate being handed over to a commoner. This game isn't over, Julian." "Get out of my train, Victor," Julian whispered softly. "Before I decide I don't like the way you are breathing my air." Victor didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and stormed out, his guards rushing out behind him. The heavy door slid shut, locking with a definitive thud. The silence that followed was deafening. The rhythmic clacking of the train tracks seemed to amplify the loud, erratic thumping of Kalen's heart. He was still pressed intimately against the most dangerous man in the city. Slowly, deliberately, Julian uncurled his fingers from Kalen's jaw and withdrew his arm from around his waist. The sudden loss of body heat left Kalen feeling strangely cold. "You adapt quickly," Julian noted, adjusting his cuffs as if he hadn't just claimed a broke archivist as his fiancée in front of a mafia warlord. "Your performance was adequate." "I did what was logically necessary to prevent an escalation of violence," Kalen said, his voice shaking just a fraction as the adrenaline began to wear off. He stood up on shaky legs, putting distance between them. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you used me to solve a political problem. I will not speak of this to anyone. I just want to go home. Please, let me leave at the next station." Julian leaned back in the leather seat, observing Kalen with that terrifying, unreadable silver gaze. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a slim, black folder. He tossed it onto the table between them. "Kalen Vance," Julian read aloud from memory. "Age 23. Employed at the National Library, a diner on 4th Street, and a freelance translation service. You reside in a subsidized apartment in the lower districts. And you owe the Crimson Skull Syndicate a sum of exactly $400,000, a debt inherited from a father who abandoned you 5 years ago." Kalen's blood ran completely cold. The world tilted on its axis. "How?" "I own the data streams of this city," Julian said simply. "While you were sleeping on my shoulder, my team ran a full background check based on facial recognition. You are drowning, Kalen. The skulls are impatient. They will not take your monthly pennies for much longer. They will take your organs." Kalen gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The stoic wall he had built in his mind was cracking. The terrifying reality of his life, laid bare in front of this monster, was too much. "Why are you telling me this?" Julian stood up. He was incredibly tall, his presence filling the cabin, suffocating the space around Kalen. He walked slowly until he was standing just inches away, looking down at the trembling young man. "Because, Kalen Vance, you now have a target on your back," Julian said softly, his voice a dangerous purr. "Viktor Volkov will not let this go. He will investigate you. He will try to use you against me. If you walk off this train alone, you will be dead before sunrise. Kalen looked up into those fractured silver eyes, seeing his own terrified reflection. What are you saying? I am offering you a new logic, Julian murmured, reaching out to gently, almost reverently, brush a stray lock of hair from Kalen's forehead. The touch was a stark contrast to the violence in his words. You play the role. You become my intended. You move into my estate, you stand by my side, and you convince the council and my enemies that you are the only one who can tame the Enigma. And in return, Kalen whispered, unable to pull away from the hypnotic pull of the Alpha's gaze. In return, I erase your debt by morning, Julian promised, his pheromones wrapping around Kalen again, this time not to crush, but to shield. I protect you from Volkov. I protect you from the world. But make no mistake, Kalen. Once you step into my world, you are mine. You do not leave until I say you leave. Kalen looked at the black folder on the table. He thought of the debt collectors pounding on his door. He thought of the constant, unending fear. And then he looked at Julian Blackwood, a man made of ice and power, a man who claimed Kalen was the only one who could quiet his mind. It was a deal with the devil. But Kalen was already living in hell. Kalen took a deep breath, locking his fears away in a mental vault. He met the Enigma's gaze with a newfound, steely resolve. Where do we start, Julian? A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smirk ghosted across Julian Blackwood's lips. We start, the Enigma whispered, by teaching you how to survive me. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Gilded Cage and the Stoic Mind. The transition from the claustrophobic tension of the Midnight Express to the back of Julian Blackwood's armored convoy was a blur of chilling efficiency. Kalen Vance did not speak. He sat in the cavernous rear of the modified SUV, the heavy, bulletproof doors sealing him inside a world of black leather and tinted glass. Beside him, Julian was a statue of dark velvet and lethal stillness, his silver eyes fixed on the illuminated screen of a tablet, effortlessly coordinating the dismantling of Kalen's old life. Kalen folded his hands in his lap, his knuckles white. The adrenaline was finally receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his chest. He closed his eyes and began the mental exercises he had practiced for years to keep from breaking under the weight of his father's debts. Identify what is within your control and what is not. He could not control the fact that Viktor Volkov wanted him dead. He could not control the terrifying, imposing enigma sitting inches away from him. He could only control his mind, his breathing, his reactions. He would not become a slave to panic. He would observe, adapt, and survive. Your heart rate is elevating again, Julian murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass Kalen's ears and echo directly in his chest. The Enigma hadn't even looked up from his tablet. Kalen opened his eyes, forcing his expression into a mask of polite neutrality. It is a natural physiological response to being abducted by the city's most feared syndicate leader, Mr. Blackwood. I am simply processing the sudden shift in my reality. Julian finally turned his head, the faint glow of the tablet catching the silver scar above his eye. You are not being abducted, Kalen. You are being relocated for your own preservation. And as of 3 minutes ago, the Crimson Skulls no longer hold your debt. In fact, their entire operation in the Southern District has been liquidated. Kalen's breath caught. $400,000. 5 years of starving, of working until his hands bled, of jumping at every shadow, erased in the time it took to drive across the city. The crushing collar of debt had been removed, only to be replaced by a chain forged of pure, terrifying power. I am indebted to you, Kalen said slowly, carefully choosing his words. No, Julian replied, his tone absolute, cutting through the dark space of the vehicle. He reached out, his gloved fingers lightly grazing the fabric of Kalen's worn coat. The touch was brief, almost phantom-like, but it sent a shockwave of heat through Kalen's system. Debt implies a transaction that can be completed. What we have is an arrangement. You are the shield that keeps the High Council and Viktor Volkov from my throat, and the silence that keeps my mind from tearing itself apart. You are not a prisoner, Kalen, but you are mine. Understand the distinction. The SUV descended into a subterranean parking vault, the heavy concrete walls sliding shut behind them with a definitive, echoing thud. The Blackwood estate, known simply as the Apex, was not a mansion. It was a modern fortress built into the cliffs overlooking the churning gray waters of the harbor. When the doors opened, Kalen was ushered out by Julian's silent, towering guards. The air here was sharp, smelling of salt and the heavy, metallic tang of security systems. Julian walked beside him, his presence an oppressive, demanding force that naturally parted the sea of suited men moving about the underground facility. Elias, Julian commanded without breaking stride. From the shadows emerged a man with sharp, predatory features and hair tied back at the nape of his neck. His eyes, a piercing amber, locked onto Kalen with immediate, undisguised suspicion. He carried the heavy, dominant scent of a pure-blood alpha, though it was instantly muted in Julian's presence. "Boss," Elias said, his gaze raking over Kalen's cheap clothes and pale, exhausted face. "The perimeter is secure. Volkov's scouts have been neutralized near the financial district. But is this him? The civilian?" "This is Kalen Vance," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, warning octave. "My intended. He will be granted Level 1 clearance. His living quarters will be in the East Wing, adjacent to mine." "And Elias?" Elias straightened, recognizing the lethal shift in his boss's tone. "Yes, Julian. If anyone in this syndicate looks at him with anything less than absolute respect, if anyone questions his place by my side, I will consider it an act of treason. Have I made myself clear?" Elias swallowed hard, bowing his head slightly. "Crystal clear, boss. Welcome to the Apex, Mr. Vance." Kalen simply nodded, maintaining his stoic facade. He recognized the dynamic immediately. Elias was the Enigma's right hand, the enforcer. Elias saw Kalen as a liability, a weak link in an otherwise impenetrable armor. Kalen knew he couldn't win them over with words. He would have to prove that his psychological endurance matched their physical violence. Julian led Kalen up through a private, glass-walled elevator that revealed the terrifying scale of the Apex. It was a masterpiece of cold, brutalist architecture, black marble, reinforced steel, and expansive, bulletproof windows that looked out over the dark ocean. It was beautiful, but it felt entirely devoid of warmth. It was a reflection of Julian Blackwood's mind, isolated, fortified, and utterly untouchable. They stepped out onto the penthouse level. The silence here was heavy, absolute. "Your quarters," Julian said, gesturing to a massive set of double doors carved from dark mahogany. "There are clothes in the wardrobe suited for your new position. The staff has been instructed not to enter unless requested. You need sleep, Kalen." Kalen stood in the center of the vast, opulent hallway, suddenly feeling incredibly small. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard now, his muscles trembling with the effort of keeping himself upright. He looked at Julian, seeing the faint, dark circles beneath the Enigma's silver eyes. The man possessed wealth beyond comprehension, power that could topple governments, yet he was starving for the most basic human necessity, rest. "You haven't slept either," Kalen noted, his voice quiet, devoid of fear. He observed Julian not as a mafia boss, but as a man suffering from severe psychological hyperarousal. The Enigma was trapped in a state of permanent fight or flight. Julian's jaw tightened. "My sleep is not your concern. It is, if my presence is supposed to provide the psychological silence you demand," Kalen countered smoothly, standing his ground. He tapped into his understanding of behavioral patterns. If he showed submissiveness now, he would be a pet. If he showed defiance, he would be a threat. He chose the middle path, calm, rational observation. "You brought me here to quiet your mind. You cannot do that if you are pacing the halls while I sleep behind a locked door." Julian took a step closer, erasing the distance between them. The scent of dark cedar and ozone spiked in the air, a physical pressure that made Kalen's lungs ache. Julian was intimidating, a predator looming over his prey, but Kalen forced himself not to look away. He focused on his own breathing, anchoring himself to the present moment. "Are you inviting me into your bed, Kalen?" Julian asked, his voice a silken, dangerous whisper. "I am stating a logical fact," Kalen replied, his pulse hammering against his ribs, though his face remained a mask of calm. "If our arrangement requires proximity for you to function, then avoiding it due to arbitrary boundaries is inefficient. I require sleep. You require my presence to sleep. The variable is the location." A startling, genuine sound of amusement, low and dark, rumbled in Julian's chest. The intense, crushing pressure of his pheromones receded instantly, replaced by something warmer, something that felt dangerously like approval. "You are a fascinating creature, Kalen Vance," Julian murmured. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against Kalen's cheek. The leather of his glove was cool, but the skin beneath it burned. "No one speaks to me of efficiency when I am standing this close to them. They usually forget how to speak entirely." Julian stepped back, the mask of the untouchable Enigma sliding back perfectly into place. "Go to sleep, Kalen. Tonight, you sleep alone. You need to process the shock to your system without the burden of my presence. Tomorrow, the war begins. We must convince the High Council that you are my heart, and to do that, you must learn exactly how to wear my brand." Julian turned and walked down the long, shadowed hallway, his footsteps making no sound on the thick rugs. Kalen entered his room and locked the heavy door behind him. The suite was the size of his entire old apartment building. The bed was massive, covered in dark, heavy silks. A wall of glass looked out over the black ocean, the waves crashing silently against the cliffs far below. He walked into the immaculate, slate-tiled bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the scalding water beat against his skin. He scrubbed away the grime of his old life, the smell of the diner, the dust of the library archives. But he couldn't scrub away the phantom sensation of Julian's fingers on his jaw, or the terrifying heat that flared in his stomach when the Enigma looked at him. He stepped out, drying off and putting on a pair of soft, impossibly expensive silk sleep pants he found in the wardrobe. He lay down on the massive bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. He was safe from the Crimson Skulls. His father's debt was gone. But Kalen knew enough about the human mind to know that physical freedom did not equate to mental liberation. He had stepped out of a cage of poverty and into a cage of gold. Julian Blackwood was a master manipulator, a man who controlled every variable in his environment. I will not let him control my mind, Kalen vowed into the silence of the room. I will play the part. I will be the perfect intended. But my inner citadel belongs to me. Despite his resolve, Kalen's exhaustion finally pulled him under. The next morning, Kalen awoke to the soft, rhythmic sound of rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a brief, disorienting second, he reached for the cheap alarm clock that wasn't there, his mind still tethered to the reality of his 3 jobs. Then, the memory of the train, the guns, and the silver-eyed Enigma rushed back, a cold splash of reality. He dressed quickly in the clothes provided. A perfectly tailored pair of dark trousers and a soft, charcoal-gray cashmere sweater that felt like a cloud against his skin. When he emerged from his room, he found Elias waiting in the hallway, leaning against the marble wall with his arms crossed. "The boss is in the solarium," Elias said, his amber eyes tracking Kalen's every movement. "He expects you for breakfast. Try not to look like a deer in the headlights, Vance. The staff talks. If you look terrified of him, the illusion breaks." "I am not terrified," Kalen said calmly, meeting the alpha's aggressive stare without flinching. "I am simply assessing my new environment." Elias scoffed, pushing off the wall. "Right. The stoic act. Let's see how long that lasts when Volkov's people start circling. Follow me." Elias led Kalen through a maze of corridors, finally opening a set of glass doors that led into a massive, light-filled solarium overlooking the sea. The rain battered the glass roof, but inside, it was warm and quiet. Julian was seated at a small wrought iron table, a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and completely covered in intricate dark ink, tattoos that looked like archaic runes and shadows woven into his skin. He looked less like a corporate CEO this morning and more like the dangerous, lethal warlord he truly was. He didn't look up as Kalen approached, but he spoke, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "Sit, Kalen. Eat." Kalen took the seat across from him. A silent attendant immediately appeared, placing a plate of fresh fruit, warm pastries, and a cup of dark tea in front of him before vanishing again. "Elias informed me you slept through the night without incident," Julian said, finally locking his tablet and setting it aside. He looked at Kalen, his silver eyes mapping Kalen's face with unsettling precision. "No nightmares? No lingering panic from the train? I have trained myself not to dwell on past events that I cannot alter," Kalen answered, taking a slow sip of the tea. It was exceptional, blooming with a taste of jasmine. Wasting energy on hypothetical terrors is unproductive. Julian leaned forward, resting his tattooed forearms on the table. The intense, predatory focus of his gaze felt like a physical weight. A very disciplined philosophy. But philosophy shatters when faced with true violence, Kalen. And you are about to step into a world built entirely on violence. Julian reached across the table. Kalen forced himself not to pull back as Julian's fingers grasped his chin, tilting Kalen's face up towards the gray morning light. The contact was firm, possessive, and electric. "Tomorrow night, we attend the High Council's Winter Gala," Julian stated, his thumb resting against the pulse point on Kalen's neck. He could feel the steady, unhurried rhythm of Kalen's heart. "Viktor Volkov will be there. The elders will be there. They will dissect every look, every touch, every breath we share. They will look for a crack in the armor. They will try to prove that you are a fake, a pawn used to avoid the marriage laws. And how do we convince them otherwise?" Kalen asked, his voice steady despite the proximity of Julian's lips to his own. "We give them a performance they cannot question," Julian whispered, his scent of cedar and ozone wrapping around Kalen, intoxicating, and heavy. In public, you will not leave my side. When I speak, you support me. When I touch you, you yield to it completely. You must look at me as if I am the center of your universe, Kalen. Can you manufacture that level of devotion? Kalen looked directly into the depths of Julian's silver eyes. He saw the cold calculation, but beneath it, he saw the deep, fractured exhaustion of a man who carried the weight of an empire alone. He didn't need to manufacture devotion. He simply needed to focus on the terrifying, magnetic pull this man exerted on him, a pull he was trying desperately to rationalize and control. I can be whatever you need me to be, Julian, Kalen said quietly, deliberately using the Enigma's first name. The intimacy of it felt like a spark dropping into a powder keg. Julian's eyes darkened instantly. His grip on Kalen's chin tightened just a fraction, a flare of genuine, unfiltered desire breaking through the Enigma's stoic mask. For a breathless second, Kalen thought Julian was going to lean across the table and kiss him, blurring the lines between their contract and reality. Instead, Julian abruptly let go and sat back, the impenetrable fortress of his aura snapping back into place. Good, Julian said, his voice completely devoid of the heat from a moment prior. Elias will spend the day briefing you on the council members, the syndicate hierarchies, and the specific etiquette required of an Enigma's mate. You have exactly 36 hours to memorize the rules of my world, Kalen. Julian stood up, looking down at Kalen with an expression of absolute, terrifying authority. Because if you fail tomorrow night, Julian warned softly, Viktor Volkov will not just take your life. He will take his time doing it. Do not disappoint me. With that, Julian turned and strode out of the solarium, leaving Kalen alone with the sound of the rain and the chilling realization that his psychological defenses were completely inadequate for the war he had just entered. The Enigma was not just playing a game with the Council. He was playing a dangerous, unpredictable game with Kalen's mind. And Kalen, for all his stoic discipline, was beginning to realize he might actually lose. End of Part 2. Part 3. The Waltz of Wolves. The transformation was not merely physical. It was an armoring of the soul. Kalen stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in the dressing room of the Apex's East Wing, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at him. The exhausted, debt-ridden archivist in the frayed coat was gone. In his place stood a figure carved from midnight and starlight. He wore a suit of deep, crushed velvet, the color of a starless sky, tailored so precisely it felt like a second skin. The fabric absorbed the light, making his pale skin look almost luminescent in contrast. Around his neck, resting just above the collar of his silk shirt, was a choker of platinum and black diamonds, a heavy, undeniable symbol of claiming. It wasn't jewelry, it was a collar. It told every predator in the room, this one belongs to the Enigma. Don't tug at it, Elias warned from the doorway, his arms crossed, his amber eyes critical. It's worth more than your entire bloodline, and more importantly, it signals your status. Without it, you're prey. With it, you're untouchable. Kalen lowered his hand, his fingers lingering for a second on the cold metal. I am not tugging, Elias. I am adjusting to the weight. It is heavier than I expected. The weight of the Blackwood name always is, Elias replied dryly. He pushed off the doorframe and walked over, handing Kalen a small, sleek earpiece. Put this in. Left ear. It connects you directly to the security team and to Julian. If things go south, and they will, you listen to the voice in your ear, not your panic. I don't panic, Kalen corrected, slotting the device into place. I analyze. Analyze this then, Elias said, his voice dropping low. Tonight isn't a party. It's a Shark Tank. The High Council has been looking for a reason to sanction Julian for years. His instability, his insomnia, they see it as weakness. If you stumble, if you look at him with fear instead of adoration, they will tear you apart before the first course is served. The door opened behind them. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Julian Blackwood entered. He was a vision of dark, lethal elegance. He wore a tuxedo of pure black, the cut sharp enough to draw blood. His hair was swept back, revealing the severe, handsome lines of his face and the silver scar that bisected his eyebrow. But it was his presence that filled the room, a suffocating, magnetic field of power that made the air feel charged with static. He stopped a few feet from Kalen. His silver eyes swept over him, starting from the polished shoes, up the velvet suit, lingering on the diamond collar, and finally locking onto Kalen's eyes. For a long, silent moment, the Enigma simply stared. The intensity of his gaze was physical, a caress that burned. Leave us, Elias, Julian commanded softly, never breaking eye contact. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second, then bowed his head and slipped out, closing the door with a soft click. Alone, the silence stretched, heavy with unsaid things. Julian stepped closer, invading Kalen's personal space until the scent of ozone and cedar was all Kalen could breathe. Julian reached out, his gloved hands adjusting the lapels of Kalen's jacket, smoothing invisible creases with a possessiveness that made Kalen's heart hammer against his ribs. "You look." Julian's voice trailed off, a rare moment of hesitation from the man who controlled the city. He cleared his throat, the mask of the stoic boss slipping for a heartbeat. "You look adequate for the role." "Adequate." Kalen managed a faint, dry smile. High praise from a man who owns half the coastline. "Do not tease me tonight, Kalen," Julian murmured, his hands sliding from the lapels to rest on Kalen's waist, pulling him in. The contact was electric. "Tonight, I need you to be my anchor. The noise in my head, it is louder than usual. The proximity of the council aggravates it." Kalen looked up into those fractured silver eyes and saw the truth. Behind the terrifying facade, Julian was in pain. The insomnia, the hypervigilance, it was a constant torture. "I am here," Kalen said quietly, instinctively placing his hands on Julian's chest over the slow, powerful thud of his heart. "Focus on my voice. Focus on the logic of the moment. We are partners in a deception. I will not let the facade crack." Julian leaned down, his forehead resting against Kalen's for a fleeting second. "Partners," he echoed, the word sounding strange on his tongue. He pulled back, his eyes hardening into steel. "Let's go. The wolves are waiting." The venue for the Winter Gala was the Grand Opera House, a colossal structure of gold leaf and red velvet that had stood for a century. Tonight, it was a fortress. Black SUVs lined the streets, and security teams from every major syndicate patrolled the perimeter. When Julian's car arrived, the paparazzi swarm was blinding. Flashes popped like strobe lights, a disorienting assault on the senses. "Eyes on me," Julian commanded as the door opened. "Do not look at the cameras. Look at me." Kalen stepped out into the chaos. The noise was deafening, shouts, questions, the roar of the city. He felt a spike of adrenaline, his fight-or-flight response kicking in. Breathe. Assess. Control. Julian was there instantly. His arm wrapped around Kalen's waist, an iron band of protection. He pulled Kalen against his side, shielding him from the flashing lights. "Walk," Julian whispered. They moved as one entity, a dark blur cutting through the crowd. Kalen kept his eyes fixed on Julian's profile, mimicking the look of someone so enamored they couldn't see the world around them. In reality, he was using Julian as a visual shield to keep from being overwhelmed. Inside, the opera house was a sea of dangerous beauty. The air smelled of expensive perfume, champagne, and the underlying metallic scent of pheromones, dominance, aggression, desire. The elite of the underworld were here. Warlords in tuxedos, heiresses with daggers in their garters. The moment Julian Blackwood entered, the room went silent. Music faltered. Conversations died. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the grand staircase. "They are staring," Kalen whispered, keeping his smile soft and fixed. "Let them stare," Julian replied, his voice projecting a terrifying calm. "They are trying to find a weakness. Show them we are iron." They descended the stairs. At the bottom, a group was waiting. At the center stood Viktor Volkov, looking like a bear in a tuxedo, flanked by a young woman with sharp, predatory features, his daughter, Anya. Beside them stood three elderly men in gray suits, the High Council. "Julian," one of the elders croaked, a man with skin like parchment and eyes like a vulture. "You are late. An Enigma arrives exactly when he intends to, Elder Vance," Julian said smoothly, guiding Kalen to stand slightly in front of him, a protective, claiming stance. "And this," the elder gestured a bony hand at Kalen, sneering. "This is the reason for your tardiness? The rumors are true. You have brought a stray into our inner circle." "Careful, Elder." Julian's voice dropped, the temperature in the room plummeting. "You are speaking of my intended. Insulting him is insulting the Blackwood Syndicate." Viktor Volkov stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Intended? A quick engagement, Julian. Even for you. My daughter and I were surprised. We didn't know you had a taste for charity cases." Anya Volkov stepped closer to Kalen, her eyes scanning him with cold, calculating jealousy. "He doesn't look like much," she said, her voice sugary sweet but laced with venom. "Tell me, pet, where did Julian find you? A library? A gutter? What tricks did you use to leash a monster?" The insult hung in the air. The circle of elites watched, waiting for Kalen to crumble, to cry, to look at Julian for help. Kalen felt Julian's muscles tense beside him. The Enigma was about to snap. No, Kalen thought. If he defends me against a girl, he looks weak. I have to fight this battle. Kalen released a small, amused breath. He looked at Anya, not with fear, but with the polite, weary patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. It wasn't a trick, Miss Volkov, Kalen said, his voice calm, clear, and perfectly projected. And it wasn't a leash. You see, monsters are only monsters to those who fear them. To those who understand them, they are simply powerful. He tilted his head, his eyes locking onto hers with a surprising intensity. Julian didn't need a leash. He needed a partner who wasn't afraid of the dark. I suspect that is why he never looked your way. A gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. Anya's face went crimson. Victor looked like he was about to explode. Julian went perfectly still. For a second, Kalen feared he had gone too far. Then, he felt Julian's hand on his waist tighten, not in warning, but in triumph. He has a tongue, the elder chuckled dryly, looking at Kalen with new interest. Sharp, intellectual, unusual. Shall we proceed to the ballroom? Julian interrupted, cutting the tension before Volkov could draw a weapon. The waltz is beginning, and I promised my intended the first dance. He swept Kalen away before anyone could respond. On the dance floor, the orchestra began a sweeping, dramatic waltz. Julian pulled Kalen close, their bodies flush against each other. You are dangerous, Julian murmured into Kalen's ear as they began to move. You insulted the Volkov heiress to her face. Do you have a death wish, Kalen? I was defending our narrative, Kalen whispered back, his hand resting on Julian's shoulder, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the suit. She attacked my position. Logic dictated a counteroffensive. Besides, you were about to tear her throat out. That would have been messy. Julian let out a low, dark laugh that vibrated against Kalen's chest. You read me too well. It is unsettling. It's my job, Kalen reminded him. Is it? Julian pulled back slightly, looking down at Kalen. The music swelled around them, a crescendo of strings. The world blurred, the watching eyes, the threats, the politics. All that existed was the man holding him. You defended me, Kalen. Not just yourself. You called me powerful, not a monster. Because you are, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You saved me from the skulls. You gave me a life, even if it is a gilded cage. To me, you are not a monster, Julian. Something in Julian's eyes shattered. The icy, silver fortress crumbled, revealing a raw, terrifying hunger. He didn't look at Kalen like a fake fiancé anymore. He looked at him like a starving man looking at a feast. Don't, Julian warned, his voice rough. Don't look at me like that. The contract. Forget the contract, Kalen breathed, caught in the magnetic pull. We are dancing. We are performing. Make it real. Julian's hand slid up Kalen's back, tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. He pulled Kalen's head back, exposing his throat, exposing the diamond collar. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just above the pulse point. It was a claim, a public, undeniable display of possession. The crowd watched, mesmerized. The chemistry wasn't fake. It was nuclear. Mine, Julian whispered against Kalen's skin, loud enough only for them to hear. You are mine, Kalen. Tonight. Tomorrow. Until the stars burn out. Kalen shivered, his knees going weak. For the first time, he didn't analyze the feeling. He didn't categorize it. He just felt it. The music ended. They pulled apart, breathless, flushed. Gentlemen, a voice interrupted. They turned. It was Elias, looking pale. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his earpiece. Boss, Elias said urgently. We have a problem. Code red. Julian's demeanor shifted instantly. The lover vanished. The warlord returned. Report. The wine, Elias said, his eyes darting to the waiters circling the room with trays of champagne. Security just intercepted a transmission from the kitchen. Volkov's men, they didn't bring weapons. They spiked the Alpha Reserve. Spiked with what? Julian demanded. Feral 9, Elias whispered. Kalen's blood ran cold. He had read about Feral 9. It was a synthetic neurotoxin banned by every syndicate. It didn't kill alphas. It stripped them of their higher brain functions. It turned disciplined leaders into raging, violent beasts driven only by instinct, bloodlust, and lust. If the alphas in this room drink that. Kalen started, his mind racing. It will be a massacre, Julian finished grimly. A bloodbath. And Volkov will use the chaos to wipe out the council and take the throne. Julian scanned the room. Waiters were already handing out glasses for the toast. The elder raised a glass to his lips. Stop them, Julian commanded. Elias, shut down the lights. Create panic. We need to clear the room. Wait, Kalen grabbed Julian's arm. If you shut down the lights, Volkov wins. He wants chaos. He wants you to look like you lost control. Then what do you suggest, strategist? Julian snapped, the tension radiating off him in waves. Kalen looked at the stage where the orchestra was playing. He looked at the microphone standing unused. We don't create panic, Kalen said, his eyes narrowing. We create a spectacle. We distract them long enough for your team to swap the bottles. Distract them? How? Kalen looked at the piano on the stage. He looked back at Julian. You said I needed to prove I belong to you? To prove I'm worthy. Kalen unbuttoned his velvet jacket and handed it to Julian. Hold this. Kalen, what are you doing? Trust me, Kalen said, rolling up the sleeves of his silk shirt. You handle the security. I'll handle the crowd. Kalen walked onto the stage, straight to the grand piano. He sat down, the silence in the room growing heavy and confused. He adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Kalen's voice echoed through the hall, calm and commanding. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a king. Before the toast, I would like to offer a gift to my intended. A composition about the nature of silence in a world of noise. He placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play a waltz. He played a storm. As the first haunting, complex notes filled the air, freezing every glass in every hand, Julian watched from the shadows. He saw Kalen Vance, the boy he had bought to save his own mind, commanding the attention of the deadliest people on earth with nothing but 10 fingers and a melody. And for the first time in his life, Julian Blackwood realized he wasn't just protecting Kalen. He was falling for him. But as the music swelled, Elias tapped Julian on the shoulder. Boss, Elias whispered, fear in his voice. We found the source of the toxin. It wasn't just in the wine. Julian turned, his eyes narrowing. Where else? Elias pointed to the ventilation vents above the stage. Above Kalen. It's aerosolized, Elias said. And it's leaking directly onto the stage. He's breathing it in. Julian's heart stopped. Feral, 9 affected alphas by making them violent. But on a civilian? On an unmarked human? It was fatal. Kalen hit a high note, and then his hand slipped. He coughed once. He shook his head as if dizzy. Julian didn't wait for a plan. He didn't wait for logic. He roared, a sound of pure, terrified fury, and sprinted toward the stage. End of Part 3. Part 4, the poison stage. The music didn't stop all at once. It fractured. Kalen's fingers, which had been dancing across the keys with the precision of a master, suddenly felt numb. The complex, haunting melody he was weaving began to fray at the edges, discordant notes slipping in like unwanted intruders. He blinked, trying to clear the sudden fog in his vision. The keys were swimming. The bright stage lights seemed to be pulsing in time with the erratic thudding of his heart. A sweet, cloying scent filled his nose, sickly sweet, like rotting jasmine. Something is wrong, his mind whispered, the thought distant and muffled. Focus. Maintain the performance. He tried to force his hands to obey, to find the next chord in the progression, but his body betrayed him. A wave of dizziness crashed over him, so violent he had to grip the piano bench to keep from sliding off. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed amplified through the microphone, cutting through the silence of the opera house like a gunshot. Then he heard it. Not the applause of the audience, but a roar. Kalen. The sound was primal. It was the sound of a beast whose mate was in danger. Kalen turned his head sluggishly toward the wings. Through the haze, he saw a blur of black velvet sprinting toward him. Julian. The Enigma was moving with terrifying speed, vaulting onto the stage, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Get back! Julian bellowed at the orchestra, his voice shaking the floorboards. Clear the stage. Now! The musicians scrambled, instruments clattering to the floor as they fled the wrath of the Blackwood boss. Kalen tried to stand, to go to him, but his legs gave out. He crumpled. He didn't hit the floor. Julian caught him. Strong arms wrapped around him, pulling him against a chest that was heaving with exertion. Kalen could feel the frantic, hummingbird beat of Julian's heart through the layers of his tuxedo. I've got you, Julian gasped, his voice ragged. He was on his knees on the stage, cradling Kalen against him, shielding his body with his own. Don't breathe deeply. Shallow breaths. Do you hear me? Shallow breaths. Julian, Kalen whispered, his voice slurring. The music. I messed up. Forget the music. Julian snarled, his eyes wild as he scanned the ceiling, locating the vents spewing the invisible, deadly mist. He pressed his face into Kalen's neck, his hand coming up to cover Kalen's nose and mouth with a white silk handkerchief. Breathe through this. Only through this. Boss. Elias's voice cracked over the earpiece, loud enough for Kalen to hear, even in his delirium. The vents are sealed, but the concentration on stage was lethal. He took a direct hit. We need the antidote. Now. Where is it? Julian demanded, lifting Kalen into his arms as if he weighed nothing. He stood up, turning to face the stunned, murmuring crowd. The med bay at the apex, Elias replied. We don't carry it in the field. It's too volatile. We don't have time to get to the apex, Julian growled. He looked at Kalen's face. It was pale, shockingly so, with a faint blue tint around his lips. His eyes were rolling back. He has minutes, Elias. Minutes. Viktor Volkov stepped out from the crowd, a glass of champagne in his hand, a look of mock concern plastered on his face. Oh dear, he drawled, his voice carrying over the silence. Is the little pet unwell? Perhaps the excitement was too much for his fragile constitution. Julian froze. He turned slowly toward Volkov. The look in his silver eyes was so terrifying, so utterly devoid of humanity, that even Volkov took a step back. If he dies, Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating promise of apocalypse, I will not just kill you, Victor. I will burn your entire lineage to ash. I will hunt down every person who shares your blood and erase them from existence. Volkov's smile faltered. Move, Julian commanded the crowd. Get out of my way. The sea of elites parted instantly. No one wanted to be in the path of the Enigma when he was in this state. Julian sprinted through the opera house, kicking open the double doors to the lobby. Elias, the car. Now. It's waiting at the curb, Elias shouted, already behind the wheel of the armored SUV, the engine roaring. Julian dove into the back seat with Kalen, slamming the door. Go. Drive. As the car screeched away, tearing through the city streets, Julian laid Kalen across the seat, ripping open his own shirt to press Kalen's face against his skin. Kalen, Julian pleaded, his hands trembling as he checked Kalen's pulse. It was erratic. Thready. Stay with me. Use that mind of yours. Fight it. Don't you dare leave me. Cold. Kalen murmured, shivering violently. So cold. I know, Julian whispered, wrapping his coat around Kalen, then pulling him into his lap, rocking him gently. I'm here. I'm warm. Focus on the heat. Focus on me. Julian. Kalen's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy, unfocused. The contract. Is it void if I die? A choked sound escaped Julian's throat, half laugh, half sob. There is no contract, you idiot. There never was. I just needed you. I just wanted you. Kalen smiled faintly. Good. I didn't want to be an employee. His eyes rolled back, and his body went limp in Julian's arms. No, Julian screamed, shaking him. Kalen. Kalen. Elias. Julian roared at the driver partition. How far? 2 minutes. Elias shouted back, swerving through traffic, mounting the sidewalk to bypass a red light. Hold on. The Apex Med Bay was a blur of white lights and shouting voices. Julian was forced to wait outside the sterile glass room. He stood there, covered in sweat and Kalen's scent, his hands pressed against the glass, watching as a team of doctors swarmed over the motionless figure on the table. They were intubating him. They were injecting adrenaline. They were fighting for every second. Boss, Elias said softly, coming up behind him. You need to sit down. You're bleeding. Julian looked down. He hadn't noticed. In his frantic run from the stage, he must have grazed something. His shirt was torn, a shallow cut on his side oozing blood. It doesn't matter, Julian muttered, not taking his eyes off Kalen. It matters if you pass out, Elias said firmly. The council is in chaos. Volkov is claiming you attacked the guests. We need a statement. My statement is silence, Julian hissed. Until Kalen wakes up, the world can burn for all I care. Hours passed. Julian paced the corridor like a caged tiger. Every time the door opened, he lunged, demanding updates. Finally, just as dawn was breaking over the harbor, the lead doctor stepped out. He looked exhausted. Mr. Blackwood, the doctor said, pulling off his mask. Julian stopped. He held his breath. He stabilized, the doctor said. Julian let out a breath that sounded like a broken sob. He sagged against the wall, his knees nearly giving out. The toxin was a concentrated dose, the doctor explained gravely. If you hadn't gotten him here when you did, another 30 seconds, and his heart would have stopped permanently. As it is, his system is in shock. He's in a medically induced coma to let his brain recover. We don't know when he'll wake up. Can I see him? Julian asked, his voice raw. He needs rest, sir. But yes. Briefly, Julian walked into the room. It was silent, save for the rhythmic beep of the monitors. Kalen lay on the bed, looking small and pale amidst the wires and tubes. The diamond collar had been removed and placed on the side table, glittering innocently under the harsh lights. Julian pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. He took Kalen's limp hand in his, bringing it to his lips. He kissed the knuckles, then the palm, then the wrist. "You fought," Julian whispered into the silence. "You fought for me. You defended me against Anya. You played a storm for me." He brushed a stray lock of hair from Kalen's forehead. "I told you I needed silence," Julian murmured, his voice cracking. "But this silence is too loud, Kalen. I can't stand it. Wake up. Scream at me. Quote philosophy at me. Just come back." He sat there for hours, holding Kalen's hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Around noon, Elias entered quietly. "Boss," Elias said, holding out a tablet. "We have a situation." "I don't care," Julian said without looking up. "You will care about this," Elias pressed. Volkov made a move. Julian finally turned his head. His eyes were cold, dead things. "What did he do?" "He didn't attack us," Elias said grimly. "He attacked the narrative. He released a video. Surveillance footage from the train." Julian snatched the tablet. On the screen was grainy footage from the Midnight Express. It showed Kalen walking into the cabin. It showed him sitting down. It showed him falling asleep. And then, it showed the moment Julian woke up. It showed the guns. It showed Kalen's terror. And then, voiceover from Volkov. "The Enigma claims this boy is his intended. But the truth, he is a hostage. A debt slave forced to play a role. Julian Blackwood didn't save him. He bought him." The video cut to a document, Kalen's old debt records with the crimson skulls, marked "paid by Blackwood Syndicate." "It's viral," Elias said. "The council is calling for an emergency tribunal. They're saying you coerced a civilian into a dangerous environment. They're saying you're unfit to lead." Julian stared at the screen. The truth, twisted, distorted, and weaponized. "They want a war," Julian said softly. He stood up, placing the tablet on the table next to the diamond collar. He looked down at Kalen one last time. "Volkov wants to destroy my reputation," Julian whispered. "He wants to take my territory. But he made a mistake." Julian turned to Elias, the silver fire back in his eyes. He touched what is mine. "Prepare the men, Elias," Julian commanded, walking toward the door. "We aren't going to the tribunal. We aren't issuing a statement. Where are we going, boss?" "We are going to the Northern District," Julian said, checking the load on his sidearm. "And we are going to remind Viktor Volkov why the Enigma is the only monster in this city that even the devil fears." He paused at the door, looking back at Kalen's sleeping form. "Guard him with your life, Elias. No one enters this room. No one." "Understood," Elias nodded. "But Julian, if you go to the north now, it's open war. You could lose everything." "I already almost lost everything tonight," Julian said, his gaze lingering on Kalen's face. "The rest is just territory." He walked out, leaving the safety of the apex, walking straight into the fire to burn down the world for the boy who had accidentally fallen asleep on his shoulder. End of Part 4. Part 5, The War for the North. The rain had turned into a deluge, hammering the city as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away the sins of the night. Julian Blackwood didn't feel it. He stood on the edge of the Northern District, his black coat soaked through, water streaming down his face like tears he refused to shed. Behind him, a phalanx of 50 men stood silent and lethal in the downpour, their weapons drawn, waiting for a single command. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an invasion. "Boss," Elias's voice crackled through the comms, tense and low. "We've breached the outer perimeter of Volkov's compound. Resistance is heavier than anticipated. They were expecting us." "Of course they were," Julian replied, his voice devoid of emotion, a flat line of deadly intent. "Victor released that video to bait me. He wants me angry. He wants me reckless." "Are you reckless?" Elias asked, a rare note of genuine concern breaking through his professional demeanor. Julian looked at the towering, fortified gates of the Volkov estate. He thought of Kalen, pale and motionless in the Apex medbay, fighting for every breath because of a poisoned stage. He thought of the fear in Kalen's eyes on the train, and the trust that had slowly replaced it. "I am focused," Julian said simply. "Tear down the gate." A massive explosion rocked the night. The heavy iron gates of the Volkov compound twisted and groaned, then collapsed inward with a deafening screech of metal. "Move," Julian roared, charging forward into the smoke. Gunfire erupted instantly. Tracers cut through the rain like angry fireflies. Julian moved with the terrifying grace of a predator, his dual pistols spitting controlled bursts that dropped Volkov's guards with clinical precision. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't seeking cover. He was a force of nature, advancing relentlessly toward the main house. His men fanned out, engaging the defenders in a brutal, close-quarters firefight. But Julian had eyes only for the mansion at the top of the hill. That was where Victor was hiding. That was where the debt would be settled. He kicked open the heavy oak doors of the main hall, shattering the lock. Inside, the opulence was staggering: gold leaf, marble statues, priceless paintings. It was a palace built on blood. And waiting for him at the top of the grand staircase was Viktor Volkov. But Victor wasn't alone. He stood behind a wall of elite guards, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. And next to him, looking terrified but unharmed, was Anya. "So the monster comes out to play," Victor boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "I told the council you were unstable, Julian. Attacking a fellow syndicate leader in his own home? This is a declaration of war against the entire underworld." "You poisoned my intended," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying over the sound of distant gunfire. He holstered one gun and pointed the other directly at Victor's chest. "You tried to kill him on live television. The council will understand retribution." "Intended?" Victor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The boy is a stray, a debt slave. I saw the files, Julian. You bought him to play a role. And now you're throwing away your empire for a piece of street trash." "He is not trash." Julian's composure finally cracked. The roar tore from his throat, raw and agonizing. "He is the only thing in this godforsaken city that is real. And you touched him." Victor sneered. "And I'll touch him again. Once I put a bullet in your head, I'll drag him out of your precious apex and finish what the poison started. Maybe I'll let Anya have him first. She always wanted a pet." That was the breaking point. Julian didn't just shoot. He unleashed hell. He fired, taking down the guard to Victor's left. He moved, sprinting up the stairs, dodging return fire with supernatural speed. He was a blur of black violence, dispatching guards with ruthless efficiency. Victor's smile vanished. He realized too late that he hadn't baited a man. He had summoned a demon. He turned to run, shoving Anya toward a hidden panic room. "Daddy!" Anya screamed as Julian vaulted over the railing, landing on the second floor, landing with a heavy thud. Julian ignored her. He grabbed Victor by the collar of his expensive suit and slammed him against the wall. The impact cracked the plaster. "The antidote," Julian snarled, pressing the barrel of his gun under Victor's chin. "Where is the formula for Feral 9? "Go to hell," Victor spat, blood trickling from his lip. Julian shifted the gun, firing a single shot into Victor's shoulder. Victor screamed, collapsing to his knees. "The antidote," Julian roared, grabbing Victor's hair and yanking his head back. "Or the next one goes in your kneecap. Then your other shoulder. Then your gut. I will take you apart piece by piece, Victor, and I will keep you alive for every second of it." It's in the lab," Anya shrieked, cowering in the doorway of the panic room. "In the basement. The blue drive. Please don't kill him." Julian looked at Anya. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. She looked exactly like Kalen had looked on the train, terrified, powerless. For a second, the rage blinded him. He wanted to end the Volkov line right here. But then, Kalen's voice echoed in his mind. "Monsters are only monsters to those who fear them. To those who understand them, they are simply powerful." If he killed Victor now, in front of his daughter, he would prove Kalen wrong. He would just be a monster. Julian lowered the gun. He stepped back, letting Victor slump to the floor, groaning in agony. "Elias," Julian said into his comms, his breathing heavy. "Secure the basement. Find the blue drive. Burn everything else." "Copy that, boss," Elias replied. "We have the perimeter. The Volkov men are surrendering." Julian looked down at Victor. "You live," he said coldly. "Not because of mercy, but because death is too easy. You will live to see your empire dismantled. You will live to see the council strip you of your rank. And you will live knowing that a stray defeated you without firing a single shot." He turned and walked away, leaving Victor broken and bleeding on the floor of his own palace. Back at the apex, the storm outside had finally broken. Julian stormed into the med bay, clutching the blue drive in his hand. His clothes were torn, soaked with rain and blood, some his, mostly others. He looked like a revenant who had crawled out of a grave. "Doctor!" Julian shouted. The medical team rushed forward. They took the drive, plugging it into the console. Data streamed across the screens, chemical formulas, molecular structures. "This is it," the lead doctor said, relief washing over his face. "We can synthesize the neutralizer. It will take an hour." "Do it," Julian commanded, collapsing into the chair by Kalen's bed. He reached out, taking Kalen's hand again. It was still cold. "I got it," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. "I got it, Kalen. Just hold on." An hour later, The clear liquid was injected into Kalen's fore. Julian watched the monitor. He watched the heart rate stabilize. He watched the oxygen levels rise. And then, he watched Kalen's eyelids flutter. Julian. The voice was weak, barely a whisper. But to Julian, it was the most beautiful sound in the universe. I'm here, Julian said, leaning forward, gripping Kalen's hand so tight his knuckles were white. I'm right here. Kalen opened his eyes. They were hazy, but the silver fog of the poison was gone. He looked at Julian, at the blood on his shirt, the exhaustion in his face, the raw, terrified hope in his eyes. You look terrible, Kalen murmured, a faint smile touching his lips. Julian let out a wet laugh, burying his face in the mattress beside Kalen's hand. I've had a bad night. Did you kill him? Kalen asked softly. Julian lifted his head. No. I dismantled him. I took his antidote. But I let him live. Why? Because, Julian said, looking deep into Kalen's eyes. You called me powerful, not a monster. I wanted to prove you right. Kalen's smile widened. He reached up, his fingers brushing against Julian's cheek, tracing the line of his jaw. You are powerful, Julian. You saved me. You saved me first, Julian whispered, leaning into the touch. On the train. In the ballroom. You saved me from the silence. Boss. Elias's voice came from the doorway. He looked battered, his arm in a sling, but he was grinning. The council is on the line. They saw the footage from the Volkov estate. They know Victor poisoned the gala. They're calling for a vote to expel him. And they want to know if the intended is alive. Julian didn't look away from Kalen. Tell them, Julian said, his voice strong and clear, that my intended is not just alive. Tell them he is the new power behind the throne. And if anyone questions his position again, they answer to me. Elias nodded and left. Julian turned back to Kalen. The contract, Julian said suddenly. It's void. Kalen blinked. What? The debt is paid. The threat is gone. You are free, Kalen. If you want to leave, if you want to go back to your library, to your quiet life, I will give you everything you need. Money, a new identity, safety. You never have to see me or this violent world again. It was the hardest thing Julian had ever said. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep Kalen, to lock him in the apex and never let him go. But he couldn't own Kalen. He had to be chosen. Kalen looked at him. He looked at the man who had burned down a city for him. He looked at the scars, the ink, the terrifying power. And he looked at the hand holding his, gentle, desperate, loving. You're firing me? Kalen teased gently. I am freeing you, Julian corrected, his voice trembling. Kalen tried to sit up, wincing slightly. Julian was there instantly, adjusting the pillows, supporting him. My old life, Kalen said slowly, was a cage of fear. I was alone. I was drowning. He looked at the diamond collar on the bedside table. Then he looked at Julian. This life, it's dangerous. It's violent. It's terrifying. Julian looked down, accepting the rejection he was sure was coming. But, Kalen continued, reaching out to lift Julian's chin until their eyes met. It's the only place where the noise stops for me, too. Julian froze. What? I don't want to go back to the silence, Julian, Kalen whispered. I want the storm. I want you. Julian stared at him, hope warring with disbelief. You stay, knowing what I am. I stay because of what you are, Kalen said firmly. My enigma. Julian didn't speak. He couldn't. He leaned down and kissed Kalen. It wasn't the fierce, possessive kiss of the ballroom. It was a kiss of gratitude, of reverence, of a promise made not in blood, but in love. When they pulled apart, Kalen reached for the diamond collar. Put it on me, Kalen said. You don't have to wear that, Julian said. You are not property. No, Kalen agreed. I am not property. I am yours. There is a distinction. Julian took the collar. His hands shook slightly as he fastened it around Kalen's neck. The click of the clasp was the loudest sound in the room. Mine, Julian whispered, resting his forehead against Kalen's. Yours, Kalen echoed. And in the quiet of the med bay, with the city burning outside and the world changing forever, the enigma finally, truly fell asleep. End of Part 5. Part 6. The Architect of Silence. 6 weeks had passed since the night the Northern District burned. The seasons were changing in the city. The harsh, biting winter rain was giving way to the cold, crisp winds of early spring. But inside the grand hall of the High Council, a chamber of ancient stone and stained glass hidden beneath the city's oldest cathedral, the atmosphere remained frozen. Julian Blackwood sat at the head of the obsidian table. He did not look like a man who had been at war. He looked like a king who had already won. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed but commanding. His hands rested on the table, still and steady. The silver scar through his eyebrow was the only visible reminder of the violence he had unleashed. Opposite him sat the remnants of the High Council. 5 elders, men and women who had controlled the underworld for decades, looked at him with a mixture of fear and disdain. And at the far end of the room, kneeling on the cold stone floor, was Viktor Volkov. The former warlord was a shadow of himself. His empire had been dismantled, his assets frozen, his territories absorbed by the Blackwood Syndicate. He was alive, as Julian had promised, but he was broken. "The tribunal is in session," Elder Vance announced, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "We are here to determine the fate of the Northern Territory and to address the irregularities of the Blackwood succession." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "There are no irregularities. There is only the new order." "Is there?" Elder Vance challenged, leaning forward. "You decimated a fellow syndicate leader's home. You nearly started a civil war. And you did it all for a boy who has no blood claim to this world. A boy you claimed was your intended, but who we know was purchased to clear a debt." A murmur went through the room. The council was trying to corner him. They wanted the Northern Territory for themselves, and they were using Kalen as the wedge to separate Julian from his power. "Kalen Vance is not a purchase," Julian said, his voice dropping to that terrifying, vibrating low register that made the elders flinch. "He is my anchor, and he is more capable than any of you sitting at this table." "He is a civilian," another elder scoffed. "A librarian. What does he know of our laws? Of our traditions? He is a weakness, Julian. An enigma cannot be ruled by a soft heart." "Then it is fortunate," a clear, calm voice rang out from the heavy oak doors at the entrance, "that I do not rely on my heart. I rely on my mind." The doors swung open. Kalen Vance walked in. He wasn't wearing the velvet of the gala, nor the frayed coat of his old life. He wore a suit of sharp, midnight blue, the cut modern and severe. His hair was styled back, revealing the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He didn't walk like a guest. He walked like he owned the building. Behind him, Elias walked a step behind, a visual confirmation of Kalen's status. The Enigma's right hand was now the consort's shield. Kalen approached the table, ignoring the gasp from the elders. He placed a heavy, leather-bound folio on the obsidian surface. The sound was like a gavel strike. "Who allowed this intrusion?" Elder Vance demanded, standing up. "I did," Julian said, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Kalen. "I believe my intended has something to say." Kalen looked at the council members, meeting each of their gazes with a stoic, unnerving calm. "You speak of tradition, elders. You speak of laws. You claim I am unfit because I am a civilian. But in the last 6 weeks, while Julian was securing the physical borders, I have been securing the history." Kalen opened the folio. "Elder Vance," Kalen began, his voice steady. "In 1998, you sanctioned the illegal sale of syndicate routes to the federal government to cover your gambling debts. I found the ledger in the Volkov archives." Vance went pale. "Elder Holloway," Kalen turned to the woman on the left. "You have been funneling protection money from the Eastern Docks into a private offshore account under your grandson's name. A direct violation of the Collective Revenue Pact." Holloway gasped, clutching her pearls. Kalen continued around the table, listing crimes, betrayals, and secrets that had been buried for years. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply recited the data with the cold, clinical precision of an archivist who had finally found the missing pieces of a puzzle. "You see," Kalen said, closing the folio with a soft snap. "You call me a weakness because I come from the outside. But it is precisely because I am an outsider that I see the cracks you have tried to hide. I am not just a librarian, elders. I am the man who knows where all your bodies are buried." Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. Julian watched him, his silver eyes burning with an emotion that transcended pride. It was awe. Kalen hadn't just survived the world of wolves. He had learned to hunt them. "Now," Kalen said, leaning his hands on the table, mirroring Julian's earlier pose, "we have a proposal. The Blackwood Syndicate absorbs the North. Viktor Volkov is exiled to the Badlands, stripped of all rank. And the Council." He paused, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips. "The Council ratifies my union with the Enigma immediately, or I release this folio to the Federation." Elder Vance looked at Julian. Then he looked at the folio. He slowly sat back down, defeated. "The Council recognizes the strength of the Blackwood Union," Vance whispered. Motion carried. Julian stood up. He walked around the table to where Kalen stood. He didn't care about the elders. He didn't care about Volkov, who was being dragged away by the guards, weeping. He reached out and took Kalen's hand, raising it to his lips in front of them all. "You are terrifying," Julian murmured against Kalen's skin. I had a good teacher, Kalen replied softly, the steel in his eyes melting into warmth as he looked at his enigma. The drive back to the apex was different this time. There was no tension, no fear. The partition was down, and Elias was humming a terrible pop song in the front seat, clearly enjoying the victory. In the back, Kalen sat close to Julian, his head resting on Julian's shoulder, the same shoulder that had started it all. You didn't tell me you found the ledger, Julian said, his arm wrapped tight around Kalen's waist, his thumb tracing the line of Kalen's hip. I wanted it to be a surprise, Kalen admitted, closing his eyes. And I wanted to see their faces. Logic dictates that leverage is best applied when the opponent feels secure. Julian chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling. You have become a ruthless tactician, Kalen Vance. I should be worried. You should be, Kalen murmured sleepily. I know where you keep the good scotch. They arrived at the apex as the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of violet and gold. The fortress didn't feel cold anymore. It felt inhabited. Kalen had filled the library with real books, not just decorative ones. He had added rugs, warmth, life. They walked into the penthouse, the door clicking shut behind them, locking out the world. Dinner? Julian asked, loosening his tie. Later, Kalen said. He walked toward the balcony doors, opening them to the cool ocean breeze. Come here. Julian followed him out. The city lay spread out before them, a glittering grid of lights. It was their city now. Kalen turned to lean against the railing, looking up at Julian. It's over, isn't it? The debt. The war. The council. It's over, Julian agreed. He stepped closer, boxing Kalen in against the railing, his body shielding him from the wind. But something else is beginning. What is that? Julian reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Kalen's breath hitched. Julian, I never asked you, Julian said softly. On the train, I claimed you. In the medbay, I collared you. But I never asked. He opened the box. Inside was not a diamond. It was a ring of black titanium, inlaid with a single sliver of meteorite. It was dark, ancient, and unbreakable. Kalen Vance, Julian said, his silver eyes vulnerable in a way the world would never see. You quiet the storm in my head. You defend my name when I am not there. You stand in the fire with me, and you do not burn. I don't want a contract. I don't want an arrangement. I want a husband. He took the ring out. Will you marry me? For real this time. No cameras. No politics. Just us. Kalen looked at the ring, then up at the man who had reshaped his entire reality. He thought of the fear he used to live in, and the safety he felt now. He thought of the silence and the beautiful, chaotic music they made together. Yes, Kalen whispered. Yes, Julian. Julian slid the ring onto Kalen's finger. It fit perfectly. Then, he leaned down and kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted of salt air, victory, and a promise kept. It was deep and slow, a sealing of souls. When they broke apart, Julian rested his forehead against Kalen's. I love you, Julian said. The words were rough and used to being spoken, but they were true. I love you too, Enigma, Kalen replied. Come, Julian said, pulling back. There is one more thing. He led Kalen back inside, through the living room, and into the library. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, polished and waiting. Play for me, Julian said, sitting in the armchair by the window, the same chair he had sat in weeks ago, exhausted and weary. Now he looked peaceful. Finish the song. The one from the gala? Kalen asked, sitting on the bench. The one from the gala. The one you wrote for me. Kalen placed his hands on the keys. The memory of the poison was gone, replaced by the strength of the ring on his finger. He began to play. The melody started soft, melancholic, the sound of a lonely man on a train, the sound of rain against a window. Then it grew. It became complex, introducing a deeper, darker bass line, the Enigma. The two melodies wove together, fighting, clashing, and then harmonizing. It wasn't a waltz. It was a symphony of two disparate souls finding a common rhythm. As Kalen played, he watched Julian. Julian's eyes were closed. His breathing was deep and even. The tension that had defined his existence for years was gone. The music swelled to a crescendo, triumphant and soaring, before fading into a gentle, lingering resolve. A final chord that didn't just end, but settled. Silence returned to the room. But it wasn't the empty, terrifying silence of loneliness. It was the comfortable, warm silence of home. Kalen stood up and walked over to the chair. Julian didn't move. Kalen smiled, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. He leaned down, brushing a kiss against Julian's forehead. Good night, Julian, he whispered. The Enigma, the most dangerous man in the city, the man who never slept, was fast asleep. Kalen went to the sofa nearby, grabbing a cashmere throw. He draped it over Julian, tucking it around his shoulders. Then, Kalen sat on the rug beside the chair. He rested his head on Julian's knee, closing his eyes. He listened to the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing, the best sound he had ever heard. Outside, the city churned on, full of noise and danger. But in here, in the apex, in the heart of the storm, there was only peace. He had accidentally fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder. And in doing so, he had woken up to a life he never dared to dream of. Kalen smiled in the dark, his hand resting over Julian's, the meteorite ring cool against his skin. And then, the architect of silence closed his eyes and joined his enigma in the dark. End of story.